Now we'll hear from Brother Kommers, Friends of Hospitality. Brother Kommers, it's a real privilege for my wife Nancy and I to be out here this weekend to be with your circuit. I appreciate the opportunity of it. And it's a fine reflection of your spirituality, the fact that so many of you come together for an afternoon of spiritual encouragement. Our subject this afternoon is an easy one to talk about the matter of hospitality. It's easy to talk about, it's easy to apply. Sometimes it can be forgotten about. It can become just kind of a hidden part of our lives. Don't think much about it. So we want to take it out today and examine the subject with a little bit of care. And just see how we really feel about hospitality and whether we're aware of the depth and the breadth of the patterns of hospitality as expressed in the Scriptures. So that we might think about it personally, perhaps you could analyze what you consider yourself to be. On a scale of 1 to 10, what kind of number would you give yourself as a hospitable person? Think of yourself, with your family, perhaps your book study group, maybe your whole congregation. Now, the purpose of our program is not to prove that you gave yourself too high a number. We're not trying to get your number down, maybe it can even rise. But just realistically think about the matter and see where you place yourself. Some people are just naturally, it seems, more hospitable than others, but scripturally there are some reasons why all of us need to consider. How would you know if you came across a hospitable person? How would you describe it? Well, in the Greek it means a person who's a lover of strangers. And that means far more than taking care of people who we know or people who we're comfortable with. It extends the word considerably. Different dictionaries in the English language render it a little bit differently, give different definitions. One said it's someone who likes to give or gives a welcome to others. Another dictionary said it's kind treatment to friends or strangers. And that dictionary caught the flavor of the Greek, didn't it? Friends or strangers. Here's one I really like. It said someone who's friendly-minded. Now, wouldn't you like to be described as friendly-minded? I would. That's one description for a hospitable person. Someone who's thoughtful, interested in the needs of others. Now, what we want to do is trace these patterns of hospitality. We're not talking about theory. We're talking about actual circumstance, things that have happened that we can base a pattern on, we can base a life course on. How far back do you think we can trace those patterns? Well, let's go to Luke, the 6th chapter, and verse 35. You see something in that verse that helps as far as tracing these patterns. The verse says, to the contrary, continue to love your enemies, to do good and to lend without interest, not hoping for anything back. And your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High, because He's kind toward the unthankful and wicked. Now, that verse helps us to appreciate that the patterns of hospitality can actually be traced all the way back to our Creator. How so? Well, notice how He deals toward the unthankful and wicked ones, those who are strangers to Him. He's still kind to them. But what do we see in the verse that helps us to appreciate that Jehovah did not intend for Himself to be the great hospitable God of the universe and then leave this characteristic or quality with just Himself? Do you note that He offers a reward to those who copy or imitate this pattern? And what is the reward that He offers? He mentions being sons of the Most High. Now, could God have offered any greater reward than to either be a heavenly or an earthly son of His? Surely no greater reward could God have offered. And He offered this to those who copy or imitate the patterns of hospitality. Now, in what way has God been kind toward these strangers? Well, in a basic way, if we go over to Matthew, the 5th chapter, and verse 45, that verse says that you may prove yourselves sons of your Father who is in the heavens, since He makes the sun rise upon wicked people and good, and makes it rain upon righteous people and unrighteous. So God provides the basic necessities of life for all mankind. He continues to do that up until now. Now, that doesn't mean that He's cared for all people in the same way, because He hasn't. While He's continued to provide the basic necessities, He is always in a special way for those who are servants of His, for those who are worshipers and lovers of Him. But He's continued to provide just these basic necessities for all of mankind. You can trace through the record of the Hebrew Scriptures various people whose lives were enriched as a result of copying these patterns of hospitality. In fact, Paul summed up the matter of how it could be done in Hebrews, the 13th chapter, and verse 2, when recommending this matter of hospitality to the first century congregation. Note what he said in verse 2, Hebrews 13, "Do not forget hospitality, for through it some, unknown to themselves, entertained angels." And those that had done that were so well known that Paul didn't feel that he needed to mention them by name. Do we remember who they were? Certain people down through history who entertained angels, not knowing who they were at the time they were being entertained. Now, it wasn't many, but there were a few. Do we remember them? Well, Abraham comes to mind, doesn't he? But along with Abraham should come Sarah. Certainly participated in this hospitable family. Then, of course, there was the relative Lot and his family. Manoah should come to mind. And then, what about the two disciples of Jesus? Remember, after his death, they were walking along from Jerusalem to Emmaus. And as they were walking along the road, a stranger came up to them. They didn't recognize him. But in the course of their conversation and their walking, they pressured the stranger into coming in and spending the evening with them. And you remember who they found out? They found out it was Jesus. Remember at the time when they were eating. Now, what would have been your reaction when you figured out who this was? I know what I would have thought. I would have thought, what in the world have I been saying all day? But once recovered from that, what a pleasure, what a privilege it would have been to entertain the now resurrected Jesus. And likely all of these people down through the years felt very privileged as a result of entertaining angels as well as Jesus. Now, why were these people? Well, the reception they were going to receive was not unknown. These people all had a pattern or a record of hospitality. These priests were the ones from the spirit realm, knew how they were going to be received. Now, we don't see this happening now, but if it was happening, would we be one selected by reason of our extremely hospitable course in life to attract the attention of the spirit realm? Well, some have, and we appreciate reading about those. Not everyone, though, was able to copy these patterns of hospitality. Jesus wasn't even able to make everyone a hospitable person, though he spent much time training in this matter of hospitality. In fact, it was one of the basic building blocks of first century Christianity. But it's important to note that he was not able to convince everyone that it was the proper way of life. Remember the rich young ruler that came to him, who was versed in the law and kept the law and wanted to know what else he should do? And what did Jesus say that he should do? Give away some of his things? Now, in comparison to keeping the law, that would have sounded reasonably easy to me, to give away some possessions. But this rich young ruler didn't see it that way. What does the record say about him? That he went away greedy. And what did he miss out on because he could not follow the advice of Jesus? Well, what did it say in Luke 6 about, we just read it, the reward that God offers to those who could follow these patterns of hospitality? This rich young ruler missed out on the privilege of serving in the spirit realm as a part of the kingdom arrangement. What a price to pay for lack of hospitality, but he did. Paul said that speaking to the Corinthian congregation, this matter of hospitality had the capacity to test the genuineness of our love. And it seems kind of strange that something as easy to care for, as easy to work with as hospitality, but access to the genuineness of love. We're going to examine how that could be a little bit later on. But why was it so important to the first century congregation, this matter of hospitality? Why did Jesus work so hard in teaching it? Why was it such a dominant part of first century Christian life? Well, there are several reasons. One, think how things were cared for and when a person had an economic problem. Today, in most places throughout the entire earth, if you have a problem financially, some governmental agency can be of assistance. But in the first century, basically it was cared for from two standpoints. One, from the family arrangement, and also some help would come from the religious system. But what did Christianity do? Jesus said it would separate people from families and it certainly separated them from the Jewish religious system. So as a consequence, when we read through the Greek scriptures, we find case after case where the Christian congregation had to care for much, much more than even today's congregation, Christian people. So this matter of hospitality, of being concerned about others, into their needs, was key to the operation of Christianity in the first century. Let's examine how it began in the 4th chapter of the book of Acts. And if we look into just a little slice of life here, it helps us to see how under the influence of Holy Spirit the brothers were acting. Acts, the 4th chapter, and verse 34. Now we recall that this area, this particular portion, deals with the many who had stayed in Jerusalem after the Passover. They stayed there much longer now. And they came into need. There was a need to care for them monetarily. They needed funds. Verse 34 says, though there wasn't one in need among them, because all those who were possessors of fields or houses would sell them and bring the values of the things sold, and they would deposit them at the feet of the apostles. In turn, distribution would be made to each one, just as he would have the need. And we learn a few things from these two verses. One, that the brothers were developing these patterns of hospitality. They were concerned about each other to the point of selling valuable things. But other things have been learned too. You see in verse 35 where they brought the value of these things? They just didn't care for it haphazardly, but it says they brought them to the feet of the apostles. So they already recognized a central governing arrangement. And then you notice the advanced way in which distribution took place. Was the distribution equally made? Not according to the record. The record says, in turn, distribution would be made to each one, just as he would have the need. Which means that some got more than others. Now, would that upset some people today? Oh, yes. Not an equal distribution, but on the basis of need. Again, that's part of the matter of hospitality. Meeting needs. Caring for what are very evident needs. Verse 36 and verse 37 talk about individuals there who did this work of possessing property, selling it, and bringing these things to the apostles. And it would seem, with this kind of a spirit running, why that everybody would be so involved that there would be no exceptions to this arrangement. But is that how it turned out? Well, we remember at least two major exceptions, don't we? They're commented on in the first verse of the next chapter. Recognize them? Ananias and Sapphira. Now, what was wrong with these people? What was their problem? Well, it's true they were greedy, but they were not hospitable people. They wanted to give an appearance of hospitality, but they were not using what they could in the interest of others. And what was the penalty? Well, God certainly made a display here of how he felt about the matter because he separated them from the congregation, didn't he? Now, what a shocking time that would have been to see Ananias struck down by God, and then a little while later, would you ever forget such a thing? If you saw God strike someone down in your midst? But what a forceful display of power on God's part. Why? Those people did not match the spirit of the first century congregation. So he separated them from it. In our discussion of hospitality, we see that the brothers in the first century worked with it. We could spend a long, long time going over the various things that were done to display hospitality. But it had a great solidifying effect upon the brothers in one place after another, as they commonly cared for each other's interests. But in our discussion today, if you only remember two words out of our discussion, could I give you the two words to remember? Hospitality is applied kindness. Try to remember those two words. Applied kindness. Hospitality is applied kindness. To illustrate, let's talk about an expression that you use, I use, and we'll continue to use it, but I do question its value. Have you ever heard someone use the expression, if you ever need help, let me know? Is that a hospitable expression? Well, it may be well motivated, but you could go through your whole life saying to someone, if you ever need help, let me know. And if no one ever lets you know, and you never helped anyone, though your motives were good, could you really be said to be a hospitable person? No. Because what is hospitality? Applied kindness. Something must happen. There must be some transfer of something. There must be some action It just means taking the initiative, using what we have, not what we don't have, not what we would expect to have, but using what we have in the interests of others. Now, this boils down to just basics as far as Christian life is concerned. This matter of being thoughtful. Sometimes we may hesitate in doing what we would like to do because we have the mistaken idea that every time we do something, it has to be special. It has to be extraordinary. But is that how our great teacher trained us? Remember, on at least 2 occasions where Jesus had large crowds of people, thousands of people listening, after he talked to them, he knew their need of food, so they had to go home. And what did he provide? Remember? 2 things. Bread and fish. Now, bread and fish were the staple of the first century diet in that area. Everybody ate bread and fish every day. And how did Jesus get that bread and fish? By a miracle, didn't he? Now, the same miracle could have produced the most lavish banquet they would have ever attended in their lives. But that's not what he did. Jesus was not ashamed to provide common, basic things. Now, it was likely very good fish, good bread. I'd like to have been there. But it was fish and bread, something people ate. Now, you sisters, when you think about having someone to your home in order to be hospitable, do you hesitate because perhaps not having something special? Now, Jesus was comfortable under special circumstances, at banquets, other things, feasts, but he was also comfortable in a simpler setting. So if the matter of providing something more than normal hinders your being hospitable, maybe time to reevaluate just exactly what you're accomplishing. If it makes it difficult for you to be hospitable because you want to prepare something special, then perhaps an adjustment is necessary. When I used to travel in the circuit work, one of the common complaints the brothers would tell me was that the elders never visited. You ever heard that? Do you know how to get an elder to your home? Oh, some say have a big problem. Well, that'll work too. But there's a better way. What would you do to get an elder? Invite him for a meal. Some of the finest shepherding done is done under that very pleasant, relaxed circumstance when everyone is enjoying a meal, be it simple or more elaborate. Now think back. How long has it been since you had an elder in your home? Would that be a good place to improve? Let's say you wanted to improve in this matter of hospitality. Is there any scriptural basis for singling out perhaps elders to be especially hospitable to? Can you think of one? Well, 1 Timothy 5:17. That verse says, "Let the older men who preside in a fine way be reckoned worthy of double honor, especially those who work hard in speaking and teaching." Now this verse has been used by clergy, religious clergymen, for almost 2,000 years now in a wrong way. They used this verse and some like it to be a basis for extracting large sums of money, people they were supposedly serving. And they've allowed themselves to live at a standard far, far higher than that of the average person they were serving. But just because the Scripture's been abused, does it mean it's not there? No, it's there. We need to care for it. Now, let's examine what it really means. Who are the older men spoken of here? Well, we recognize them as elders in the congregation. And how did they get to be that way? Well, years help, but there's a list of qualifications found in more than one place in the Bible. Now, think about that list of qualifications. Can you think of something that's in that list that is not in the list of qualifications for ministerial? But it is in the list of qualifications for an elder. Not teaching everything. And it's the matter of hospitality. If you look down the list of qualifications for a ministerial service, hospitality is not there. It'd be fine if it was there, and likely it is in many. But especially for an elder, it's a scriptural requirement. And hopefully, if it's raised to the level of an art in the life of an elder, it should also be in his family. But why is that qualification in the Scriptures? Why is it so important now? Well, here's the reason. It's in this verse. The elder may receive more care, double honor, it says here, more attention even. Now, how will he use? He might even end up some way or another with more in a material way. How will he use that, though? Well, if he has a pattern or a record of being concerned about other people, whether he has little or a lot, he will use that in their interests. So it's a fine thing to have as a qualification for an older man, an elder in the congregation. We had very few problems over the period of a century with financial problems within the Christian congregation. And this is one of the reasons the men appointed are above reproach along this line. It's certainly different than Christendom. But we do have a responsibility to show double honor, special care toward those. And we may, in a fine way, care for that by inviting elders into our homes. By extension, could we include hardworking ministerial servants? And could we also include regular pioneers that work day in, day out? How are we caring for them? Even the auxiliary pioneers. Is April generally the month when most auxiliary pioneers are around here? Now, how do we feel? Perhaps we're one who does not qualify as an auxiliary pioneer. I'm one, I don't qualify. With my work at Bethel, I couldn't put in the time, so nobody would appoint me as an auxiliary pioneer. But now, then what could I do to show the auxiliary pioneers that my spirit is right with them? Or to the regular pioneers, what could we do to show that we really would like to be doing what they are, but our circumstances prevent us? Can this field of hospitality somehow come into play here? Can we show our concern for them by having them over for a cup of coffee, maybe in the middle of the morning? Can we go out to a meal with them at the end of a period of field service? Can we share with them in field service? We know they might be having a time when not many are out. The point is, what can we do to show how we feel? Not just good thoughts, but we want to deal with applied kindness, accomplishing something, so we meet a need. We get spiritually built up, and so do they. It's in harmony with the Scripture. So if we're looking for ways to strengthen this hospitable nature, then those are some. We could also deal with our next-door neighbors. We can deal with relatives. Why, there are 5 billion people out there now on the earth, aren't there? And most of them strangers. So being kind to them, we could work at that. And some people over the years have built a reputation for themselves. Remember Lydia in the first century? Now, she got a reputation not by saying you've got to come over for a meal sometime. Looking back at that woman, what does the record say? You could boil down that to 2 words. Applied kindness. There was an accomplishment. Not just, you've got to come over for a meal sometime. We all have the same privilege in the congregation to share along that line, and it may be easier for some than others. There are certain cultures, certain backgrounds that just are friendly and gregarious, where there's one, there's 20. And we may say, well, that's not my background. People I had from parents and grandparents and great-grandparents stayed to themselves. We're conservative people. But we're Christians now. We're Jehovah's Witnesses. And this matter of the patterns of hospitality should influence us no matter what our background. It may require more diligence on the part of some than others, but it would be good for us to work at it. Let me mention just a few things over the years that have affected me, experiences I've had or things I've seen that had a bearing on how I feel about hospitality, and they coincide with scriptural responsibilities that we have in this matter. I think you'll agree that there is value of sharing things with others, because when something good happens to us, we tend to talk about it, don't we? So not only have we been influenced by something good, but now we talk about it, somebody else comes to know about it, they're influenced by it, and it just keeps going. Let me mention something that happened interesting a number of years ago. How many of you here attended the 1946 Cleveland Convention? Oh, you. Have to be more careful how I tell the story. All right. That's about the first convention. It is the first convention I can remember attending. Our family traveled by special train to Cleveland in 1946. And we had a problem when we got there. And those of you who were there may well remember it. There weren't enough rooms for everyone. It's not that the brothers in Cleveland weren't hospitable. They were. But it was just after the end of World War II, and the brothers did not know how many were coming. There were a few motels, not that many hotels, and not that many brothers in the Cleveland area. And so many came, there just weren't enough rooms for everyone. Well, now around Municipal Stadium in downtown Cleveland is a park. It's still there, but it's different now. You can't sleep in it. But back in those years, many brothers prepared to sleep in that park. And our family of four, one family that prepared to sleep there. Now across town was a couple named Alice and Jerry who had done what they should. They had told the rooming department, "We have a room, send us somebody." Now it's not clear to me anymore how they knew, but somehow they knew that the couple who'd been assigned weren't coming. I don't know. Late at night before the convention. Now Alice and Jerry were truly hospitable people. What do you think they did? They drove back across Cleveland, all the way across, down to the stadium, went to the park, and began looking under the trees for someone to share their home. Now they came to our family. We were four. They only had room for two. They only had one bed, but we didn't have any bed. So after some discussion, it was decided that we go with them. You know, about the only thing I can remember of the Cleveland Convention is all four of us sleeping in one bed and eating donuts in the morning. And you may say, oh, that's really a good spiritual memory of the whole thing. But before you write it off that way, let's talk about it for a minute. Here's a little boy, not yet 5 years old, who's 2,000 miles from home, without a bed, no place to eat, and somebody takes him in and sees him. Does it make an impression? Oh yes. And why? Because Jehovah made us that way. Jehovah made us to be influenced deeply by the kindnesses of other people. That's why it's part of our worship, to be concerned about others. It doesn't have to be in big ways, but in little ways do we think about other people. It does make an impression. I remember that. How long ago was that, boys? It's a long time back, but it's very clear to me. Something else happened. Back in the early 60s when I was at Bethel the first time, I remember having a speaking assignment way out on Long Island. I traveled out there by train. Brother picked me up and took me to a very large home. I could see that the family lived there. And when I got inside the door, I was talking to Mother and Father. A little boy came over to me, just a little boy, about 4. And as I'm talking to Mother and Father, this kid begins beating me on my leg. And he's saying something, and I finally listen to what he's saying. He's saying, take off your shoes. But I didn't pay any attention. I was just standing at the door, talking to the parents, and so I'm talking. The kid is still beating me, telling me to take off my shoes. So finally I do it. And what do you think he did? He ran running into his room with my shoes. Guess to do what? Oh, I'm sure they needed it. But this was strange behavior. Now I walked on through the house, and I got to the kitchen, and there were good smells coming out. Got in there were cookies everywhere. On the table, on the counter, stove, everywhere there were cookies, and they didn't offer me one. That didn't seem very hospitable. Now, Sunday night, when I went to go back to Bethel, there stacked up on the table were boxes and boxes of cookies. For Bethelites they knew, some they didn't, and also one for me. Now, why did they do that? Because there aren't any cookies at Bethel? No. What did you see? What do you see in what I'm describing for you? Now, I don't remember the name of the family. I wish I did because I'm back in New York now, but I don't remember who they are. Those children are grown. If you were invited to their home, how would you expect to be received? Hospitably? And if you were, it would just be an accident, wouldn't it? Oh, no way. Those parents were working hard at training the patterns of hospitality into their children. They were not leaving it to chance. Hospitality is not inherited. Those parents knew that. Parents, you have a real privilege, as well as a responsibility, to train into your young ones these long-standing patterns of hospitality that are part of the Christian heritage. How are you doing along that line? Real emphasis needs to be placed on it because of the increasingly selfish disposition of this world. Children are not taught hospitality in school. And sometimes even surface manners are taught. But that's not hospitality. The world has a policy, you share with me, I'll check it out, and then I'll share with you. Isn't that about the way it works? And isn't it true that in social giving, gifts that pass between people are almost always of equal value? See, that's a social arrangement of things. But hospitality involves meeting needs, caring for specific situations, being concerned about others. Children need to be taught that. And however you parents go about doing that, please give it some attention, because there are so many young ones in our organization, and so many hundreds of thousands coming in every year out of this greedy system, that unless we reinforce and strengthen these patterns of hospitality and make them stand out very clearly, this reputation that Jehovah's Witnesses have had for years will be harder to maintain. Let me mention something else. This is an illustration. This didn't happen. Can you picture a two-family house? Let's say you live on one side and a lady lives next door. And in your backyard, you have a place for a garden. And for some reason, you love tomatoes, let's say. And so you've planted the whole thing in tomatoes. And you have a beautiful crop of tomatoes. You go out there and you eat tomatoes, you eat tomatoes, you eat more tomatoes, and you still can't eat them all. And one day you're standing out there and you're looking at all these tomatoes and you feel rather guilty. And then you remember that the woman next door loves tomatoes. And she can't leave the house. She's incapacitated. She has no way even to leave the home. So, you gather up a box or a bag or a basket, something full of tomatoes, and you take them to the woman next door. You knock at her door. She comes to the door. Now, likely, what would be the dialogue? What would you say to her as you hand her the tomatoes? Now, wouldn't it include, likely, and properly so, something to the extent that you had so many tomatoes in your backyard that you wanted her to have some? Wouldn't there be some element of that likely in what you would say? It would seem so. Now, is that hospitality? Yes. Why? Well, where were the tomatoes? In your backyard. Or on the napkin? On her table. Tomatoes move. Who moved them? You did. Whether you had little or whether you had a lot, it's not really the issue now. But you did apply kindness here. You took something you had, you could have eaten, and you moved it somewhere else. And she took the tomatoes. It's hospitality. Let's move ahead here. Same situation. You're here, she's here, tomato patch back here. You grow all these tomatoes, beautiful crop again. But one night, disaster befalls them all, except one. There it is. Right on the edge. You look out at it, you see it, and you see your neighbor looking at it. What are you going to do with that tomato? You're going to wait nightfall, make believe another disaster happened? What are you going to do? You're going to march right out, bring it in, cut it in two, and give your neighbor the smaller half. What are you going to do with that tomato? What you do with that one tomato, made well, know something about your hospitality. Sometimes it's easier to share out of an abundance, sometimes it's not. But the point is, are we willing whether we have a lot or whether we have a little? Have you ever eaten the whole tomato? What did we learn by it? Would we do it again? Have we learned to think of someone else ahead of ourselves? Have we learned really to think about sharing? John said, "My children, your love must be genuine and show itself in action." And you could boil everything that John said there down into two words. That my children, your love must be genuine and show itself in action. You can boil it down to two words. Applied kindness. Some of the happiest people who've been alive are those who have worked hard. But why have they done it? Just because they want the reputation for being nice people? Oh no, much more than that involved. And I believe that the longest illustration that Jesus ever gave is recorded in Matthew chapter 25. That's the illustration of the sheep and the goats. Now, we recognize different eventualities of both, life and death. But how was the decision made? Do you remember what the pivot point, what the whole thing boiled down to? Do you remember what Jesus said? It boiled down to, because you received me hospitably. How could Jesus do that? How could he take life and death and boil it down to one point like that? And say, you didn't receive me hospitably, off you go. You did receive me hospitably, come this way. Not difficult. Because true Christian hospitality comes from a heart that's approved by God. It comes from a heart that's been educated according to Jehovah's Word. And that kind of a heart shows itself in many, many ways. One of the ways It boils down to this matter of concern for above self. Let's look at a point in Proverbs, the 3rd chapter and verse 27, because this is kind of a bearing principle that happy people have used for years as to how to run their lives. Now that verse says, "Do not hold back good from those to whom it's owing, when it happens to be in the power of your hand to do it." Who do we thank for the power of our hand? Who do we thank for our possessions, for our talents, for all the things that we have? Daily we thank our God, don't we? Now then, if we would hold back from using what we have that could benefit someone else, if we hold back from doing that, are we not in essence saying, Jehovah, thank you for what I have, but I dare not use it because I don't know if you'll replace it? See, none of us want to be in that kind of a position. We want to use the abilities, the talents, the assets, whatever we have, in the interests of others. Are we willing to do that? Are we making progress in doing that? Well, we have opportunity, tremendous opportunity before us to do it. No one is reading us. All of us have the ability. Sometimes it happens in ways that we're able to do it that are outstanding. Other times it's just small things. Let me mention one that was an outstanding way that I just happened to hear some years ago that demonstrates this matter of concern one or the other. It involves a couple who for years had been serving Jehovah. The family was now grown. The brother was in his middle 50s. And he'd always taken the lead in the preaching work and in organizational matters. In fact, he'd been very active in what we call convention work. Not much of it is done anymore because of the way things are organized, but years gone by, he was a major issue. And this brother and his wife spent some time each summer working in the rooming department, managing it. He did it for years. But now the brother decided he wanted to expand his spiritual horizons. He wanted to leave his job, and he wanted to go move out, serve with the needed grade, and get into the special pioneer work. And he did that. But this severely adjusted his economic circumstance. So much so that another year went by, and along came an invitation for him to spend considerable time caring for a district convention assignment. This time, this was means to care for it. As a matter of fact, it was going to be difficult, very difficult, to maintain his apartment where he was specialing. The special pioneers were living on a very small allowance years ago, and he just didn't know how he was going to handle this. Then they got the idea. A few months before, they had a problem. They'd run out of money, and they'd gone to the landlord and explained the problem. The landlord said, "No problem. Just catch it up as the months go by." Nice kind of landlord, right? So they thought, well, that's what we'll do. Explain the thing, and he'll let us do that. So they went to the landlord, explained what they wanted, that a month's rent slides could go here, this convention arrangement work. And the landlord said, "I'm sorry, I can't do it. I'd like to, but policy's changed. You have to pay the rent or leave." Well, he needed an apartment, you have to. So this saddened them, but it caused them to think more seriously about the matter. And so they narrowed down exactly what they were short. And they figured that they needed only $47 to carry out their assignment. Now that may not sound like a lot of money now, but years ago they didn't have it. And they pondered more and more, and they finally decided, we're not going to let that stop us. We're just going to go ahead and head out to the assignment, and we're going to take care of it. On the way out of town, they stopped at the post office, went through the mail. They came across an envelope with no return address, postmarked from a town they didn't know, opened up inside $47. Well, the brother told the story, and I don't mind telling you now how I wasn't pleased. I've heard that kind of story before. And I was glad he had his $47. He went to the convention, he's happy. I never thought any more about it. Some years went by, and one evening when we were in the circuit work, brother hadn't finished milking his cows where we were staying, and we went out to the barn to milk his cows after the meeting. And of all things, we got talking about things he'd done his wife didn't know about. And he said, one time I was out here milking the cows, and I got to thinking about it, brother, and just wondered if he needed any help. And he said, I just decided in my mind that when I got back in the house, I would just take everything I had in my wallet and send to him. So he said, I counted out $47. I looked at the brother. I was 1,000 miles and several years from where I heard this other. I said, I know where the money went. He said, no, you don't. I don't even know if the brother ever got it. Now, when I told him the circumstance of the thing, it was his turn to get cold all over. Coincidence? Maybe. You decide. But let me tell you about the brother. This brother didn't get out in service much, and he didn't get to Kingdom Hall very much. But he thought about people. He was sitting on his tractor, milked a cow, thought about people. Tried to figure ways. Now he's an elder, he does go out in service. He does cook meetings. But he still thinks, fine quality to have, isn't it? That's what Jehovah wants us to do. Are we thinking about people? Are we thinking about ways to care for them? People we know and people we don't know. Now, we began our discussion, Hebrews 13:2, but there's more in that chapter. Let's turn. The 16th verse of Hebrews 13 says, "Do not forget the doing of good and the sharing of things with others. For with such sacrifices, God is well pleased." Obviously, they're talking about being hospitable. Let's key in on one word, the word sacrifice. What do you think of when you hear the word sacrifice? Now, I know what I think of. I think of the millions of animal sacrifices offered by the nation of Israel. Now, how do you picture them being made? Do you picture a faithful Israelite man on his way on a trail up to Jerusalem? He's walking up toward Jerusalem, and as he walks up the trail, why, here a turtle dove crashes, walks over on the trail and dies. And the Israelite man says, "Good idea." And now picks up the now dead bird, walks up to the priest of the temple, says, "Here." Is that how you picture a faithful Israelite making a sacrifice? Oh, a turtle dove would be acceptable if it was alive. He didn't have a really big animal in his pasture back home. But what's the point? For a sacrifice acceptable to God, it must be prepared. It can't be something accidental. It can't just happen. So for the sacrifices that are being talked about here in verse 6, for them to constitute something that God is well pleased with, they must be something we prepare. It must be something we could have used. We could have done something else with. But instead, we chose to use it another way. We chose to use it in the interests of others. That involves the pattern of hospitality. How are we doing along that line? Well, Jehovah's people as an organization are doing very well, but this is somewhat in contrast to the late 70s, isn't it? Remember, that was a time when we became a little more concerned about ourselves, our families, the places we were living, rather than the great evangelistic work that God wanted done. Now we've changed that. We've adjusted that matter, and what's happening worldwide? Now that we are making the proper sacrifice again. Now that we have our priorities straight. Now that we're willing to go to strangers, those we don't know, those that are difficult to talk to, but we're willing to make that sacrifice. Is God well pleased with it? And do we see evidence of it? Oh, yes. Are we making a sacrifice? Do we have concern for those people? We look out at the world of mankind and we know what will happen to them unless they make an adjustment quickly. Can we help them make that adjustment? Our efforts along that line may well make the difference. So the sacrifices we make that God is well pleased with certainly are appropriate here. But they must fit in with a pattern of life. It can't be just one person running from door to door all the time saying, "This is the way I'm hospitable, this is the way I'm caring for people." Jehovah wants us to be comfortable in life. And it's surprising how comfortable we can be as God's people in the midst of a dying system, isn't it? We can still get some enjoyment from life. We can serve Jehovah, be confident of His approval. We see fruitage from our work. All of this happening when a world is collapsing around us. But it testifies to the wisdom of the instructions that we receive. It's just a matter of our following those instructions. The pleasant, warm environment, the atmosphere that is generated by Jehovah's people is an outstanding thing. So much so that when people come to the Kingdom Hall for the first time, what do they remember? You could have had the best speaker in the world and they don't know. What do they remember? The warmth is at the Kingdom Hall. Now, I never attended a church. I don't know what's that. But it can't be what we have. Because whenever people leave it and come to a Kingdom Hall, they say, "What is this?" There's a big difference there. Now, that's not an accidental difference. That's an arrangement. That's part of the training, part of the pattern that we're following as far as hospitality is concerned. And if we're alert to those needs, if we're alert to continuing this warm, spiritual atmosphere in our homes, we're concerned about each other, we find ways to make certain that we're influencing others for good, that we really are concerned with each other, then we have great reason to be happy in this time. But it does require care. It does require us to think about it. When we think about it, then in order for us to be hospitable, something else has to happen. What are the two words we want to remember? Apply kindness.